In this video, we are going to be discussing the false doctrine within the Mormon Church, better known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is one of the largest non-Christian cults in the world today. This doctrine is called the 3 degrees of glory, that there are 3 actual places to spend eternity, 3 levels of heaven, depending on your obedience to the gospel and your works in this human life on earth will determine one of the 3 levels of heaven you will spend eternity in. The highest being the celestial kingdom in Mormonism, which is where God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ are. If you make it to this highest level, you will spend eternity in their very presence. But if you get sent to the terrestrial, or the lowest, the telestial kingdom, you won't be in their very presence. These are lower levels of heaven. This doctrine is completely unbiblical, and Mormons, or I should say Joseph Smith, the one who originated this cultish teaching, got this out of pure biblical stupidity and taking 1 Corinthians chapter 15 entirely out of context. That's what Mormons do in order to back up their theology, is they take a single verse, one single verse, cherry pick it, rip it out of its context, isolate it, and then build an entire theology on top of it. Instead of reading on both sides of the verses, or the verse, in context, on both sides, to find out what is really going on. This doctrine did not originate, however, with Joseph Smith. It originated by an occult book writer. He was an occultist who wrote a book in the 1700s. His name is Emanuel Swedenborg. You can still order this book online at Amazon. In 1734, he published a book, Heaven and Hell and Its Wonders. I might have the exact name of the book wrong, but you can Google it. I'm not going to do all the footwork here for you. Anyways, in this book, he taught there are 3 levels of heaven. This is what the occult believes about heaven. This is an occult teaching. It comes directly out of the world of the occult. This is occult philosophy. Emanuel Swedenborg described the 3 degrees of glory identical to how Joseph Smith does. A celestial kingdom, a terrestrial kingdom, and a telestial kingdom. 3 different levels within heaven. Emanuel Swedenborg also taught eternal marriage, which is another Mormon doctrine, and other things that the Mormons teach, which originated not from Joseph Smith, but from the teachings of the occult. Emanuel Swedenborg's written works was available in Joseph Smith's day in his area. As a matter of fact, they were advertised in the local paper, on sale for 37 cents. Smith knew about Swedenborg and his writing on this subject. He read it and he loved it. Smith even made a comment on it, but criticized Swedenborg for not trying to profit more on his ideas. So Smith knew about it, read it, and liked the idea. And all of a sudden, poof, 3 degrees of glory enters into Mormonism. But we're not going to discuss the history and his plagiarizing on this particular video. We're going to quickly go over what the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is really talking about. The Apostle Paul is not speaking about 3 different places to spend eternity at all. He is not talking about places, but what appears to the naked eye. Now we'll get to that in a second. Let's get some context. What was Paul really talking about? What's the subject here? 1 Corinthians 15, it starts in verse 35. Paul is asked a question. At the resurrection, what kind of body will we have? Paul calls the question foolish, but he answers it anyways. And from this point through the rest of the entire chapter, the subject is on bodies and the resurrection body, not places. Paul is not answering the question, how many places are there to spend eternity, Paul? Where will we go to spend eternity, Paul? How many kingdoms are there, Paul? How many levels of heaven are there, Paul? No. This is not the subject. This is not the topic. This is not what the Apostle Paul was asked. He was asked about the resurrection body and what kind of body will it be? This is the topic, not places. Paul uses many different analogies to describe the bodies. Paul goes on to say that there are many bodies living that vary from one another. Different kinds of flesh, bodies. Fish are different from birds. Birds are different from humans, etc. He speaks of the 4 different kinds of flesh in speaking on living bodies on earth, to show that the living bodies on earth are all different from each other. Again, men, birds, fish, etc. The 4 different kinds of flesh. Then Paul goes on to speak of the inanimate bodies of creation, the non-living bodies, above the sun, moon, and the star, and describes how they are all different from each other. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, and each star is different from another star in glory. And just as there is a difference in all the living bodies on earth from one to another, and just as there is a difference in all the non-living bodies of creation above the sun, moon, and stars, so there is also going to be a difference in the body that we will have at the resurrection versus the body that we have now. That's all Paul is talking about. Bodies, and he's using analogies. Living bodies, the 4 different kinds of flesh, and the verses after that he describes non-living bodies, the bodies of creation, sun, moon, and stars, and describes their differences. He's not talking about kingdoms at all. Now let's go into the modern translation here. What does glory mean? Glory does not translate into kingdom or kingdoms. Glory is a descriptive word, and it means what appears to the naked eye. It has been translated into 4 main words which modern Bible translations will use: brightness, brilliance, beauty, and splendor. So now let's go to a modern translation, which again, the modern versions will use one of these 4 words. There is one brightness of the sun. There is another brightness of the moon. And there is another brightness of the stars, and each star is different from another star in brightness. Isn't the sun brighter than the moon? Isn't the moon brighter than the stars? And doesn't each star differ from another star out there in the cosmos in its brightness? Yes, Paul is talking about what appears to the naked eye. He's not talking about places. If the 3 glories can mean 3 literal kingdoms to spend eternity in, then using the same logic, I could say the 4 different kinds of flesh that the Apostle Paul speaks of means 4 kingdoms, So now there's actually 4 kingdoms to spend eternity in. You see the stupidity that Mormons use? Some modern translations will say the sun has one kind of beauty. The moon has another beauty. And the stars have their own beauty. And one star is different from another star in its beauty. That's all Paul's talking about. Again, what appears to the naked eye. When you look up and you look at the bodies of creation above, the sun, moon, and stars, they are all different from each other in their beauty, in their brightness, in their brilliance, in their splendor. That's all Paul is pointing to. Objects of creation that we can see with our physical eye. And he's pointing out the fact, look, all these bodies of creation are different from one another in their beauty and their splendor, etc. And just as they're all different from each other, and just as all the living bodies on earth are different from each other, our next body in the next life will also be vastly different from the one we have now. He's not talking about places to spend eternity. So glory does not translate into kingdoms. Now let's talk about terrestrial and celestial. Terrestrial does not translate into kingdoms either. Terrestrial means anything on earth. That means earthly. I myself, I'm a terrestrial being. I reside on planet Earth. A bird is a terrestrial animal. It resides on Earth. It means earthly. Anything that is on this earth is a terrestrial object. Or if it's living, it's a terrestrial being. A terrestrial animal, etc. It means earthly. It does not mean a kingdom or kingdoms. It has nothing to do with the kingdom. The word celestial means anything that is above the surface of the earth. Anything in the earth's atmosphere and outside the earth's atmosphere, outer space. The sun, the moon, these are celestial objects. They reside in outer space. Look up the word. You won't find kingdom. In science, they are literally called celestial objects. Celestial does not translate into a kingdom. It means anything in the Earth's atmosphere or outside of it in outer space. What about telestial? There is no such thing as the word telestial. It does not exist anywhere in New Testament Greek, Old Testament Hebrew. It does not exist in the English language. It cannot even be found in a dictionary. The word doesn't exist. Outside of the occult and occult philosophy and theology, the word has no meaning. The occult uses the word telestial. Again, Emanuel Swedenborg was an occultist and a book writer who wrote about occult theology and described the levels the same way Joseph Smith does, because Joseph Smith plagiarized his version from Emanuel Swedenborg. The occult is where you will find this. Not a single ancient manuscript of the Bible contains the word telestial. It is nowhere. It doesn't belong in 1 Corinthians 15. It was never there to begin with. That word was added, forced into the passage in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible to give the 3 levels. In reality, there's only 2 things that Paul mentions, terrestrial and celestial, and we just went over what they mean. There is no such thing as 3 levels of heaven. Now a Mormon will say, well, what about 2 Corinthians 12:2? It says Paul knew a man who was caught up to the 3rd heaven. In antiquity, in biblical times, Old Testament times, New Testament times, they did not have such words like atmosphere or outer space to describe the vastness of creation above the surface of the earth. These words did not exist. What the Jews did is they would break down creation into three categories by using the word heaven. Three heavens. The first heaven meant simply the earth's atmosphere. Everything that we can see by day. The clouds, where the birds fly, where the airplanes today fly in. This was the first heaven. Literally the firmament of the earth. The second heaven is what we see by night, which is beyond the earth's atmosphere. Outer space, where the stars and the sun and the moon are. That's the second heaven that God created. The third heaven, in Jewish thinking, was literally where God, their creator, resides. That is a kingdom. This heaven we cannot see into. This is the kingdom of God. So the three heavens was literally God's creation, which the Jews divided up into three parts. The earth's atmosphere, beyond that, into outer space, and then the third one is where God is. They weren't three literal kingdoms to spend eternity in based on your level of works and obedience here in this earth life. Not at all. What we're dealing with here is the fact that Mormonism don't know Jewish thinking. They're completely ignorant. And how Jews broke up the creation into three parts, each called heaven. Because the words outer space, atmosphere, these things didn't exist in biblical times. So they used other words, other ways of describing the creation of God, and broke it up into three parts. Again, each part called heaven. And if you grab a study Bible, grab any study Bible you want to, I don't care what. You can go online and Google biblical commentary on 2 Corinthians 12:2, and this is the answer you're going to get again and again and again and again and again. The fact that the three heavens were the Jews' way of dividing God's creation into three parts because certain words did not exist in the day the Bible was being written. Again, such as outer space, atmosphere, so forth. So, Mormonism has created a doctrine based on complete biblical ignorance, taking verses out of their context, and complete utter ignorance of Jewish thinking at the time and how they viewed the creation, how they divided it up, how they spoke about it. This doctrine was simply plagiarized by Joseph Smith. It comes from the occult. The Bible nowhere in 1 Corinthians 15 teaches three places to spend eternity. There is only one. You are going to be in the very presence of God for all eternity, or you are going to be in hell in the presence of Satan and his demons for all eternity. One or the other. There's not one of three levels and then the other. No. Two outcomes only. God's kingdom, one kingdom, or hell. With God or with the demons. That's it. Mormonism is a non-Christian cult with unbiblical doctrines. I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope it has taught you something. My series on Mormonism will continue. This is only part 1. So I hope you will subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for more parts.